Cassandra Whitmore heard the words before she understood them. "I release you," Edmund said, his voice flat and cold, as if he were speaking about a debt rather than a woman he had promised to marry. The music from the ballroom spilled through the open doors behind him, bright and merry, completely unaware of the small cruelty happening just outside its glow. For a moment, Cassandra could not move. She stood on the stone steps in her pale blue gown, gloves pressed tightly together, staring at the man she had known since childhood, as if he had suddenly become a stranger. Around them, a few guests were arriving late, their carriages rattling over the gravel, and two of them slowed just enough to catch the tail end of the scene. She saw the flicker of interest in their eyes. She knew, in that instant, that by morning all of London would know her name in a way she never wanted. Edmund did not look sorry. He adjusted his coat and glanced past her shoulder toward the ballroom, already thinking of the evening ahead without her. "Your family's fortune is not what it once was," he said, as if this explained everything. As if 5 years of promises could be erased with one sentence about money. "Lord Granger's daughter comes with a fortune 3 times what your father can offer. I am certain you understand." She did not understand, not really, but she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Cassandra straightened her spine, the way her mother had taught her to do when the world tried to press her down, and she said only, "Then I wish you joy of her fortune, Edmund." She turned before he could answer and walked toward the garden path, away from the light, away from the music, away from the 2 guests who were already whispering behind their fans. The night air was cool against her flushed cheeks. She walked quickly, not caring where the path led, only that it led away from the ballroom and the man who had just discarded her like an old glove. Her mind raced through every moment of the last 5 years, every letter Edmund had written, every dance they had shared, every promise made beneath quiet stars. All of it seemed, had been worth less to him than a larger dowry. She did not notice the figure standing near the hedge until she nearly walked into him. "Forgive me," she said quickly, stepping back, expecting an apology in return, expecting to be waved along by some bored aristocrat annoyed at having his solitude disturbed. Instead, the man simply looked at her, his expression calm and unreadable in the moonlight. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing that made him nearly part of the shadows himself, and there was something steady in the way he held himself, something that made her suddenly aware of how her hands were trembling. "You have nothing to apologize for," he said. His voice was low, even, without the mocking edge she expected from every man at this party. "I believe I am the one intruding on your evening." Cassandra studied him for a moment, trying to place his face. She recognized him vaguely from a few gatherings over the past year, a man who rarely spoke, who stood at the edges of rooms and watched more than he participated. She had heard whispers that he was the Duke of Rothbury, though she had never exchanged more than a polite greeting with him. "I did not mean to disturb you, Your Grace," she said, hoping her voice did not betray how close she was to tears. "I was only looking for a quiet place to collect myself." He did not press her for details, though something in his gaze told her he had already guessed at least part of what had happened. Instead, he gestured toward a bench beneath a large oak tree, its branches heavy with early summer leaves. "If you would like company, I will not intrude with questions," he said. "If you would prefer solitude, I will leave you to it without offense." It was such a strange offer. No man had ever given her the choice before, not even Edmund, who had always assumed his presence was welcome regardless of her wishes. Cassandra hesitated, then found herself walking toward the bench, grateful simply to sit somewhere the world could not watch her. They sat in silence for several minutes. The distant sound of music drifted through the trees, soft and unreal, as if it belonged to another world entirely. Cassandra stared at her hands, at the small tremor she could not quite control, and tried to steady her breathing.
"You are not going to ask what happened,"
she said finally, half surprised by her own words. "I assumed, if you wished to speak of it, you would," the Duke replied. "And if you did not wish to speak of it, my asking would only make the evening harder for you." He paused, then added quietly, "I saw enough from where I stood. I do not need the details to understand the shape of it." Something about his honesty loosened the tight knot in her chest. She looked up at him properly for the first time, taking in the sharp line of his jaw, the quiet intelligence in his eyes, the complete absence of pity in his expression. He did not look at her as though she were broken. He looked at her as though she were simply a person having a difficult evening, deserving of basic kindness and nothing more complicated than that. "He is a fool," the Duke said, so quietly she almost missed it. Cassandra let out a small, unsteady laugh, more surprised than amused. "That is not a very dignified thing for a duke to say about a viscount's son." "Perhaps not," he agreed. But it happens to be true, and I have never found much use for saying things I do not believe simply because they sound more proper. They talked a little after that, though not about Edmund. He asked about the book she had been seen reading at Lady Pembroke's tea the previous month, and she found herself surprised that he remembered such a small detail. She asked, in turn, why he so rarely danced at these gatherings, and he admitted, with the faintest trace of humor, that he had never learned to enjoy crowded rooms, though he had learned to tolerate them out of duty to his position. The conversation felt easy in a way nothing had felt easy in hours. For a few minutes, Cassandra almost forgot the humiliation waiting for her beyond the garden, almost forgot that by tomorrow her name would be attached to whispers and pitying glances at every tea and every ball for weeks to come. But eventually, practical matters returned. She could not sit in the garden all night. Her mother would be looking for her soon, and the carriage would be called, and she would have to walk back through that ballroom, past every eye that had witnessed her humiliation, or would soon hear of it secondhand. "I should return inside," she said, though she made no move to stand. The Duke studied her for a moment, as though weighing something in his mind. Then he said, "You do not have to walk through that ballroom tonight if you would rather not. My carriage is at the front gate. I would be glad to see you and your mother home safely, without the need to pass through a room full of people who have nothing better to do than watch." Cassandra blinked, caught off guard by the offer. It was not the kind of thing men said to her, not without expecting something in return, some debt to be repaid later in dances or attention or promises. But there was nothing calculating in his tone, no hidden expectation waiting beneath the surface. "Why would you offer such a thing?" she asked, unable to stop herself. "You do not know me well at all." He considered the question seriously, as though it deserved a real answer rather than a polished excuse. "I know enough," he said finally. "I know that a person deserves kindness on the worst night of their season, regardless of whether I know them well or not. That seems reason enough to me." Cassandra did not know how to respond to that. She had spent 5 years learning the rules of courtship from Edmund, rules built on convenience and appearances and calculated affection. This man seemed to operate by an entirely different set of principles, ones she did not yet understand but found herself curious to learn. In the end, she accepted his offer, and together they walked to the front of the house, where his carriage waited beneath the lamplight. Her mother was found, quietly informed of the change in plans, and though she raised an eyebrow at the Duke's presence, she said nothing critical, sensing perhaps that this was not the moment for questions. As the carriage rolled away from the estate, Cassandra glanced back once at the glowing windows of the ballroom, at the music and light she had left behind. Somewhere inside, Edmund was likely dancing with his new fortune, already forgetting the 5 years he had spent with her. She felt a fresh wave of humiliation rise in her chest, sharp and bitter. But beside her, in the quiet corner of the carriage, sat a man who had asked nothing of her except a moment of honest conversation. She did not know yet what it meant, or where it might lead, or whether kindness offered on the worst night of her life could ever grow into something more lasting. But for the first time since Edmund's cold words on the steps, she felt the tight grip of despair loosen just slightly in her chest. The Duke said little more during the ride, seeming to sense she needed quiet rather than conversation. But as the carriage slowed before her family's townhouse, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Whatever is whispered about tonight, know that none of it reflects poorly on you. The fault belongs entirely to a man who could not recognize what he had." Cassandra met his eyes in the dim carriage light, and for the first time all evening, she managed a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly. "I will try to remember that." As she stepped down from the carriage and walked toward her front door, she did not look back, but she could feel his gaze following her until the door closed behind her. She had come to that ballroom expecting an evening of dancing and quiet happiness with the man she had loved for years. She left instead with her heart in pieces and her reputation hanging by a thread. Upstairs in her room, Cassandra sat by the window for a long time before removing her gloves. The house was quiet, her younger sister already asleep, her father away at his club, unaware that his daughter's engagement had ended on a stone staircase in front of strangers. She thought about telling her mother everything in careful detail, but decided the truth could wait until morning, when she had found some steadier version of herself to present. She thought instead about the strange calm of the man who had sat beside her in the garden. He had asked for nothing. He had offered no false comfort, no empty promises that everything would be well again by morning. He had simply been present, steady and honest, in a moment when she had expected only cruelty or pity. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt larger than anything Edmund had given her in 5 years of courtship. She undressed slowly, laying her blue gown across the chair, and caught her own reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry now, her face pale but composed. She did not look like a woman who had been humiliated in front of half of London. She looked, she decided, like someone who had survived something and come out the other side still standing. Tomorrow would bring whispers. She knew this with complete certainty. The story would spread through drawing rooms and tea parties before noon, twisted and reshaped with each retelling, until she barely recognized herself in the gossip. Some would pity her, others would delight quietly in her misfortune, the way people always did when someone once admired fell from grace. She would have to face all of it with her chin lifted and her voice steady, exactly as her mother had taught her. But as she finally climbed into bed and closed her eyes, it was not Edmund's cold words that lingered in her mind. It was the quiet certainty in the Duke's voice when he had called him a fool, and the strange, unexpected comfort of sitting beside a stranger who asked for nothing in return. She did not understand yet what any of it meant. She only knew that somewhere in the wreckage of this terrible night, something small and unexpected had begun, waiting patiently for time to reveal its true shape. By the second morning, the whispers had already found their way into every corner of the city. Cassandra learned this the moment her mother entered the breakfast room with a folded letter in her hand and an expression that told her everything before a single word was spoken. Lady Ashcombe writes that the entire matter is being discussed at every table in Mayfair, her mother said, setting the letter down with a sharp motion. She says Edmund is already parading Miss Granger about as though the engagement were announced years ago rather than days. Cassandra kept her eyes on her tea, willing her hands to remain steady. Then let them talk, she said quietly. There is nothing I can do to stop it now. Her mother studied her for a long moment, something softening in her expression despite the tension in the room. You are handling this with more grace than I expected, she admitted, though I confess I would not blame you for a good deal less grace, given the circumstances. It was not grace, not entirely. It was simply the only option left to her. Cassandra had spent the previous night turning the humiliation over and over in her mind, until exhaustion finally silenced her thoughts, and she had woken determined not to let Edmund's cruelty define the rest of her season. She would attend the events she was expected to attend. She would hold her head high. And she would give the gossips nothing more to feed on than what had already been said. The days that followed tested that resolve more than she anticipated. At Lady Pembroke's afternoon tea, 3 women she had once considered close friends suddenly found reasons to sit at the far end of the room, murmuring behind their cups whenever she glanced their way. At the milliner's shop, she overheard 2 strangers discussing her situation as though she were a character in a serialized novel rather than a living woman standing only a few feet away. Not a fortune left to speak of, one of them said, hardly surprising he found someone better suited. Cassandra did not correct them. She simply paid for her ribbon and left, her spine straight, her expression carefully blank until she was safely inside her carriage, where she allowed herself exactly 1 moment of anger before folding it away again. It was nearly a week later, at her aunt's modest gathering for close family friends, that she saw the Duke again. She had not expected him there, had assumed a man of his rank rarely attended such quiet, unremarkable affairs, and the sight of him standing near the window, speaking politely with her uncle about crop yields of all things, startled her enough that she nearly dropped her cup. "Your Grace," she said when he finally approached her, unsure whether to be pleased or embarrassed by his presence. "I did not expect to see you here. I was invited some months ago, before I knew the date would fall so soon after recent events," he said, his tone carefully neutral, though something in his eyes suggested he had chosen to attend anyway, rather than send his regrets. "I hope my presence is not unwelcome." "Not unwelcome," she admitted, "though I confess I am curious why a duke concerns himself with a gathering as small as this one." He considered the question for a moment, as he seemed to consider most things before speaking. "I find small gatherings considerably more honest than large ones," he said. "Fewer people performing for an audience, more people simply being themselves." Cassandra found herself smiling, the first real smile she had managed in days. "That is a very unusual philosophy for a man of your position." "Perhaps," he agreed, "though I have never much cared for philosophies that require constant pretending." They spoke for a while longer, about nothing of great importance, and yet Cassandra found the conversation easier than any she had managed since the ballroom. He asked no questions about Edmund, offered no pity about her circumstances, and seemed entirely content simply to discuss the book on her aunt's shelf or the unusually mild weather for the season. It was, she realized with some surprise, the first time in over a week that she had spoken with someone who made her feel like herself again, rather than a subject of gossip to be handled carefully. After that afternoon, she began noticing him more often, though never in any way that suggested deliberate pursuit. He appeared at the bookshop on the same afternoon she visited to collect a novel she had ordered weeks earlier, engaged in quiet conversation with the shopkeeper about a shipment of rare volumes. He attended the same church service her family attended the following Sunday, seated several rows back, offering only a polite nod when their eyes met near the entrance afterward. He was present, without ever being intrusive, a steady figure at the edges of her ordinary life. Cassandra told herself these encounters meant nothing beyond coincidence, that a man of his rank moved in the same limited social circles as everyone else of consequence in the city, and their paths were bound to cross now and then regardless of intention. But as the weeks passed, she found herself looking for him in every room she entered, and feeling a small, private disappointment on the occasions he was absent. Her mother noticed before Cassandra was willing to admit anything to herself. "You seem in better spirits lately," she observed one evening, watching her daughter over the top of her needlework with obvious curiosity. "Considering everything." "I am simply trying to move forward," Cassandra said, though the words felt slightly less true than they had a month earlier. Her mother said nothing more on the subject that evening, but Cassandra caught her studying the Duke's occasional presence at their social gatherings with sharp, assessing eyes, the way a woman studies something she suspects but has not yet confirmed. It was at a small musical evening hosted by one of her father's business associates that the Duke finally spoke more directly about what had happened that night in the garden. Cassandra had stepped out onto the balcony during a break in the performance, needing a moment of quiet air away from the crowded room, and found him already there, leaning against the railing and studying the darkened garden below. "I did not mean to intrude," she said, moving to leave. "Stay if you like," he said. "There is room enough for two people who prefer quiet to conversation." She stayed. For a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to stand beside each other in comfortable silence while the muffled sound of a violin drifted from the room behind them. Eventually, it was the Duke who broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual. "I have wondered, since that night, whether I overstepped," he said, "whether my presence added to an already difficult evening rather than easing it." Cassandra turned to look at him, surprised by the admission. "You did nothing but offer kindness at a moment when I received very little of it elsewhere," she said honestly. "If anything, I should have thanked you more properly than I did." He seemed to consider this for a moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the garden. "I confess I have thought of that evening more often than I probably should," he admitted, "not because of the circumstances that brought us together, which I would not wish repeated for your sake, but because of what came after." Something in his tone made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not quite name. "And what came after?" she asked quietly. He turned to face her fully then, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "An evening spent in the company of someone who did not require me to perform," he said, who spoke honestly, even in the midst of her own difficulty. "I have attended a great many balls and dinners in my life, Lady Cassandra, and very few of them have felt as genuine as those few minutes in your aunt's garden." Cassandra did not know how to respond to such honesty, unaccustomed as she was to men speaking so plainly about their thoughts, rather than dressing them in flattery or calculated charm. She only knew that his words settled something restless in her chest, some small doubt she had been carrying since Edmund's betrayal about whether she was capable of inspiring anything beyond convenient affection. Before she could form a proper reply, the doors behind them opened, and several other guests spilled out onto the balcony in search of fresh air, breaking the fragile privacy of the moment. The Duke stepped back slightly, the careful distance of public propriety returning to his posture, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than strict manners required. "Perhaps we should return inside," he said, offering his arm with perfect, practiced formality, "before anyone begins to wonder at our absence." Cassandra took his arm, aware of the warmth of his sleeve beneath her fingers, aware too of how easily she had begun to trust the steadiness of his presence in a season that had otherwise offered her very little steadiness at all. As they walked back into the crowded, glowing room, she found herself wondering, for the first time since that terrible night on the ballroom steps, whether something good might yet come from the wreckage Edmund had left behind. She did not allow herself to hope too much. Hope, she had learned recently, could be a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands. But as the Duke released her arm at the doorway and offered a small, private smile meant only for her, she thought that perhaps, this time, hope might not be so foolish after all. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur of music and polite conversation, though Cassandra found her attention drifting more than once toward the tall, quiet figure standing near the far wall, engaged in some discussion with her father about matters of trade. It struck her, watching him, how differently he carried himself compared to Edmund. Edmund had always sought the center of every room, laughing loudly at his own jokes, ensuring every eye found its way to him eventually. The Duke seemed entirely unconcerned with being noticed, content to remain at the edges, watching rather than performing, and yet somehow he drew her attention more completely than Edmund ever had. It was her father, of all people, who mentioned him again on the carriage ride home that night. "A steady sort of man," he said, apropos of nothing, staring out the window at the passing streets. "Rothbury, I mean. Asked me a great many sensible questions about the shipping contracts. Not the sort of idle chatter I expect from young lords these days." Cassandra kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart gave an unexpected flutter at the casual mention of his name. "He seems a serious sort of man," she offered, as though the observation cost her nothing at all. "Serious, yes," her father agreed, "but not unkind with it. There is a difference, you know, between a man who is serious because he has nothing pleasant to say, and a man who is serious because he takes the people around him seriously enough to bother listening." He paused, glancing at his daughter with a knowing look that made her cheeks warm despite the evening chill. "I only mention it because I noticed you two speaking rather a long while on the balcony this evening." "We were simply enjoying quiet air," Cassandra said quickly, perhaps too quickly, judging by the small smile that crossed her father's face before he returned his attention to the window and said nothing further on the matter. 2 days later, Cassandra encountered Edmund for the first time since the ballroom, and the meeting tested her composure far more than she expected. She had gone to visit a friend's shop near the fashionable end of the street when she spotted him coming out of a jeweler's, Miss Granger on his arm, both of them laughing over some private joke. For a moment, Cassandra considered turning away entirely, avoiding the confrontation altogether, but Edmund had already seen her, and pretending otherwise would only make the moment more awkward. "Cassandra," he said, his tone carrying the same easy confidence he had always possessed, as though 5 years of promises meant nothing at all now that they had been discarded. "You look well." "As well as can be expected," she replied evenly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "Congratulations on your engagement. I hope you and Miss Granger will be very happy." Something flickered across his face at her calm tone, some flash of surprise, perhaps even disappointment that she had not reacted with the tears or bitterness he might have expected. Miss Granger, for her part, offered a tight, uncomfortable smile, clearly aware of the history between them, and clearly wishing to be anywhere else. "We are very happy," Edmund said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. "I heard you have been keeping company with the Duke of Rothbury." "I have enjoyed his friendship, yes," Cassandra said carefully, unwilling to give Edmund any further material for gossip, though she noted with quiet satisfaction the flicker of something like jealousy crossing his features before he could hide it. "How fortunate for you," he said, his tone edged now with something less pleasant than before. "Rothbury is known to be rather particular about his company. I would not read too much into a bit of polite attention, if I were you." Cassandra held his gaze steadily, refusing to let the barb land the way he clearly intended it to. "I appreciate your concern, Edmund," she said, "though I find I trust my own judgment on the matter well enough. Good afternoon to you both." She walked away without waiting for a response, her heart pounding but her steps steady, and it was not until she had turned the corner onto the next street that she allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding. The encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not because of any lingering affection for Edmund, but because his words had planted a small, unwelcome seed of doubt about the Duke's intentions that she had not carried before. That evening, she found herself turning the conversation over in her mind, long after she had retired to bed, wondering whether Edmund's cruel insinuation held any truth at all, or whether it was simply the bitter parting shot of a man who could not bear to see her recover from what he had done. She thought of the Duke's steady presence in the garden that first terrible night, of his honest words on the balcony only days before, and decided, finally, that whatever uncertainty the future held, she would not let Edmund's jealousy poison what small hope she had allowed herself to feel. 3 weeks after the encounter outside the jeweler's shop, Cassandra received an invitation that made her hands tremble as she read it. It came not from the Duke directly, which would have been improper, but from his aunt, Lady Winslow, a sharp-eyed widow known throughout the city for her elegant garden parties, and her complete lack of patience for foolishness. The invitation requested Cassandra's presence at a small afternoon gathering the following week, and though the request appeared entirely ordinary on its surface, Cassandra suspected there was little that happened in Lady Winslow's household without her nephew's quiet involvement. Her mother, reading the invitation over her shoulder, could not hide her satisfaction. "Lady Winslow does not extend invitations carelessly," she said, folding her hands with the air of a woman already planning ahead. "This means something, Cassandra. You must know it does." "I know nothing of the sort," Cassandra replied, though her own pulse quickened at the thought of seeing him again in a setting more private than a crowded ballroom or musical evening. "It is simply a garden party, Mother. Nothing more." But it was, in fact, considerably more. When Cassandra arrived at Lady Winslow's townhouse the following week, she found a gathering far smaller and more intimate than she expected. No more than a dozen guests scattered across the elegant garden, engaged in quiet conversation over tea and delicate pastries. The Duke was there, of course, standing near a rose-covered trellis in conversation with his aunt, and something in the careful way Lady Winslow arranged the seating throughout the afternoon left Cassandra with little doubt about the true purpose of the invitation. Lady Winslow, for her part, made no effort to disguise her intentions once the other guests had settled into their own conversations. She guided Cassandra toward a quiet bench near the far end of the garden, ostensibly to admire a particularly fine collection of roses, and there she spoke with the directness her nephew clearly inherited from her side of the family. "My nephew has spoken of you," she said, without preamble, studying Cassandra with sharp, assessing eyes. "Not often, mind you. He is not a man given to idle chatter about his private thoughts. But when he does speak of you, there is something in his voice I have not heard in a very long time." Cassandra did not know how to respond to such directness, unaccustomed as she was to older relations speaking so plainly about matters usually left to careful implication. "I hold your nephew in great esteem," she managed finally, aware of how inadequate the words sounded compared to what Lady Winslow was clearly asking about. Lady Winslow's expression softened slightly, though her sharp eyes lost none of their assessing quality. "He is not an easy man to know," she continued. "His father was a cold sort of man, more concerned with duty than affection, and it left its mark on my nephew in ways he does not often show the world. He learned early to keep his own counsel, to trust few people beyond a small circle. That he has allowed you into that circle so quickly tells me a great deal, whether he has said so directly or not." Before Cassandra could formulate a response, the Duke himself approached, apparently having noticed his aunt's lengthy conversation with their guest and grown curious, or perhaps concerned, about what might be said in his absence. "Aunt Winslow," he said, a note of gentle warning in his tone, "I hope you are not subjecting Lady Cassandra to one of your interrogations." "I am simply enjoying pleasant conversation with a delightful young woman," Lady Winslow replied with an air of complete innocence that fooled no one present, "though I confess I was just telling her what a pity it would be if certain gentlemen allowed their natural caution to prevent them from pursuing something worth pursuing." The Duke's expression remained carefully composed, but Cassandra noticed a faint color rising along his jaw, the first genuine embarrassment she had seen from him since their acquaintance began. "Perhaps Lady Cassandra would enjoy seeing the rest of the garden," he said, offering his arm with slightly more haste than strict propriety required. "My aunt's roses are lovely, but her conversation can grow tiresome rather quickly." "I heard that," Lady Winslow called after them, though her tone carried more affection than reproach as she watched her nephew lead their guest away toward the quieter paths at the garden's edge. Once they were sufficiently out of earshot, the Duke offered something close to an apology, though there was a warmth in his expression that suggested he was not entirely displeased by his aunt's interference. "I hope she did not say anything to make you uncomfortable," he said. "She has never learned the value of subtlety, even after all these years." "She said nothing I minded hearing," Cassandra replied honestly, and found herself smiling at the memory of the older woman's directness, "though I confess I am curious what exactly you have said about me to prompt such conversation." The Duke was quiet for a moment, considering his answer with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to most things. "I told her that I had met someone whose company I valued more than I had expected to value anyone's company again," he said finally. "I did not realize she would take that as an invitation to arrange entire garden parties around the confession." Something warm settled in Cassandra's chest at his words, though she tried to keep her expression measured, unwilling to reveal how deeply the admission affected her. "That is a rather significant thing to say," she observed quietly. "It is," he agreed, "and I do not say it lightly." He paused near a small stone fountain, the water trickling softly beside them, and turned to face her more directly than he usually allowed himself in public settings. "I know it has not been very long since events that caused you a great deal of pain, and I have tried to be patient, to allow you the time you need without pressing for more than you are ready to give. But I find myself wanting to be honest with you about my intentions, rather than allowing you to wonder or worry about them, particularly after whatever unpleasant things Ashworth has likely suggested." Cassandra's breath caught slightly at the mention of Edmund, surprised the Duke had somehow guessed at the doubt planted by that chance encounter outside the jeweler's shop. "How did you know about that?" she asked. "London is a smaller place than it appears," he said, a hint of dry humor in his tone. Word travels quickly among those who enjoy repeating it. I do not know precisely what was said, but I can guess well enough at Ashworth's methods, having observed his character rather closely these past weeks. She considered denying the effect Edmund's words had left on her, but found she did not wish to hide anything from this man who had been nothing but honest with her since that first night in the garden. He suggested I should not read too much into your attention, she admitted quietly. That you were known to be particular about your company, and that I should not expect anything lasting from it. The Duke's jaw tightened slightly at this, though when he spoke, his voice remained gentle. Ashworth understands very little about my character. If he believes my attention to you has been idle or careless, he said. I am, admittedly, particular about the company I keep. I have spent a great many years watching men and women perform affection they do not feel, calculating advantage in every glance and every conversation, and I long ago decided I would rather remain alone than participate in such performances myself. And what is this? She asked softly, gesturing between them. Performance or something else entirely? Something else entirely, he said, without hesitation, his eyes steady on hers in a way that left no room for doubt about his sincerity. I have watched you these past weeks navigate humiliation and gossip with more grace and courage than I have seen from most people facing far smaller difficulties. I have found myself looking forward to small, ordinary moments simply because they might include the chance of seeing you. That is not performance, Lady Cassandra. That is something considerably more real than anything I have felt in a very long time. The words settled over her like warm sunlight after a long, cold season, and for a moment, Cassandra could not find any response adequate to match the weight of what he had just shared. She thought of Edmund's careless cruelty, of the calculated affection he had offered for 5 years while quietly weighing her worth against her dowry, and the contrast between that hollow performance and the Duke's careful honesty struck her with sudden, overwhelming clarity. I do not know what to say to that, she admitted finally, her voice unsteady with emotion she had not expected to feel so strongly. You need not say anything at all, he replied gently. I did not share my thoughts to demand a response, only to ensure you understood them clearly, without doubt or confusion left by other people's careless words. Whatever pace feels right to you, I am content to follow it. I have waited this long already. I find I do not mind waiting a while longer, if it means arriving at something built on honesty rather than haste. They walked a while longer through the quiet paths of the garden, the conversation drifting to lighter subjects, though something had shifted between them in those few private moments near the fountain, some unspoken understanding settling into place that neither of them felt the need to name aloud just yet. When it came time for Cassandra to return home, the Duke walked her to her carriage himself, and as he helped her inside, he held her hand a moment longer than strict propriety required, his thumb brushing gently across her gloved knuckles in a gesture that said more than any further words could have managed. I will call on you properly next week, he said, if that would be welcome. It would be very welcome, Cassandra replied, and meant it completely, feeling for the first time in weeks that the future held something worth looking forward to, rather than merely something to endure. As the carriage pulled away from Lady Winslow's townhouse, Cassandra glanced back once to see the Duke still standing at the gate, watching until the carriage turned the corner and disappeared from view. She thought of her mother's earlier certainty that the invitation meant something significant, and found herself, for the first time, willing to believe it might be true. Whatever doubts Edmund's cruel words had planted in her mind now felt small and foolish, easily outweighed by the steady, patient honesty of a man who had chosen, again and again, to offer her nothing but the truth. That evening she wrote in her private journal for the first time in weeks, filling the pages not with grief over what she had lost, but with careful, hopeful thoughts about what she might yet gain. She did not know precisely where this new path would lead, whether the Duke's careful courtship would blossom into the kind of lasting partnership she had once believed she was building with Edmund. But she knew, with growing certainty, that whatever came next would be built on far steadier ground than anything Edmund had ever offered her, and that certainty alone was enough to carry her hopefully into whatever the coming weeks might bring. True to his word, the Duke called on her the following week, arriving at her family's townhouse with a small bouquet of flowers chosen, he admitted with a faint smile, not for their beauty but because her aunt had once mentioned they were her favorite. Her father received him in the drawing room with obvious approval, the two men falling easily into conversation about matters of business and land management, while her mother watched from her chair with the quiet, satisfied expression of a woman who had suspected this outcome for weeks. After a proper interval, her father excused himself, allowing the young couple a measure of privacy within the bounds of propriety, her mother remaining nearby with her needlework as chaperone. Cassandra found herself unexpectedly nervous, more so than during any of their previous conversations, aware now that this visit carried a different weight than their chance encounters at parties and gatherings. "I confess I have thought carefully about what to say to you today," the Duke admitted, seated across from her near the window, sunlight catching the sharp planes of his face. "I do not wish to rush you, particularly given how recently your trust was so carelessly broken. But I also do not wish to leave you uncertain of my intentions any longer than necessary." Cassandra folded her hands in her lap, steadying herself against the sudden quickening of her pulse. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have grown rather tired of uncertainty these past weeks. I would welcome plain speaking, whatever it might bring." He seemed to appreciate her honesty, something like relief crossing his features before he continued. "Then I will speak plainly," he said. "I have no interest in a courtship built on games or careful calculation, the sort of thing that seems to occupy so much of society's attention. I am interested in knowing you properly, in earning your trust through steady, consistent honesty, and in allowing whatever grows between us to grow at whatever pace feels right to you. I do not expect promises today. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove, through actions rather than words alone, that I am nothing like the man who hurt you." The sincerity in his voice left little room for doubt, and Cassandra found herself believing him completely, the last small traces of Edmund's poisonous words finally dissolving beneath the weight of the Duke's evident honesty. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "I would like the chance to know you properly as well, without the shadow of gossip and calculation hanging over every conversation." They spoke for the better part of an hour, covering subjects far removed from courtship, discussing books and travel, and the small, ordinary details of daily life that somehow felt more meaningful shared between them than they ever had with anyone else. Cassandra found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, and more than once caught her mother hiding a small, pleased smile behind her needlework. When it came time for him to depart, the Duke lingered a moment at the door, his voice dropping to something more private despite her mother's presence nearby. "Word has already begun to spread that I have called on you properly," he said. "I suspect the same drawing rooms that once whispered about Ashworth's cruelty will soon find something entirely different to discuss." "Let them talk," Cassandra replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I find I care considerably less about their opinions than I once did." "That," he said with evident approval, "is precisely the kind of courage I admired in you from the very beginning." After he left, Cassandra's mother finally set aside all pretense of her needlework, turning to her daughter with barely contained excitement. "Well," she said, "I believe we may finally allow ourselves some cautious optimism about this season after all." Cassandra said nothing, but she could not entirely suppress her own smile as she watched the Duke's carriage disappear down the street, carrying with it the growing certainty that perhaps, after everything Edmund had taken from her, something far better had been waiting patiently all along. In the days that followed, she noticed a subtle shift in the way people greeted her at the shops and social gatherings she attended. The pitying glances that had followed her for weeks began to soften into something closer to curiosity, and once or twice she overheard fragments of conversation that suggested the story circulating about her had changed shape entirely, no longer centered on Edmund's cruelty but on the quiet, growing attention of a Duke who had never before shown such interest in any woman of the season. She found she did not mind this new gossip nearly as much as the old, though she still preferred, whenever possible, to simply let her own steady conduct speak louder than any rumor could. Her younger sister, only recently old enough to attend such gatherings herself, pressed her for details one evening with the eager curiosity of youth, asking whether she truly believed the Duke intended marriage, and whether love could really grow so quickly from such an unlikely beginning. Cassandra considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to promise more than she herself yet knew for certain. "I believe," she said finally, "that some things grow more truly when they are given proper time to take root, rather than rush toward conclusions before they are ready. Whatever this becomes, I intend to let it grow honestly, without forcing it into a shape it is not yet prepared to hold." Her sister seemed satisfied with this answer, though she could not resist teasing that Cassandra's cheeks colored rather noticeably whenever the Duke's name was mentioned in conversation. Cassandra did not bother denying it. For the first time since that terrible night outside the ballroom, she found she had nothing left to hide, and considerably more to hope for than she had allowed herself in a very long while. The truth came to Cassandra sideways, the way most important truths seemed to arrive, not through the Duke's own admission, but through a careless remark from one of Lady Winslow's servants during her next visit to the townhouse. She had gone to return a book borrowed weeks earlier, and while waiting in the small parlor for Lady Winslow to finish a conversation elsewhere in the house, The young maid arranging fresh flowers nearby had spoken without thinking, assuming perhaps that Cassandra already knew what half the household staff apparently understood as common knowledge. "His Grace was very taken with you even before your engagement ended," the maid said conversationally, arranging a rose with careful attention. "Lady Winslow used to say it was a great pity he could not court you properly, seeing as you were already promised to another gentleman. She said he watched you rather a lot at gatherings, though he never once tried to interfere with an existing engagement, not being that sort of man." Cassandra sat very still, the book forgotten in her lap, as the full weight of this revelation settled over her. "Before your engagement ended," the maid had said, meaning the Duke's interest had existed not weeks but potentially over a year, quietly and honorably restrained the entire time she had believed herself devoted to Edmund. She thought back to a dozen small moments now recontextualized by this new understanding. Glances across crowded ballrooms she had barely registered at the time, a certain quality of attention she had dismissed as simple politeness from a man known for his reserve. "Forgive me, my lady," the maid said suddenly, catching sight of Cassandra's stunned expression and seeming to realize, too late, that she had spoken of something not meant for casual conversation. "I did not mean to speak out of turn." "You have not upset me," Cassandra assured her quickly, though her voice trembled slightly with the effort of processing what she had just learned. "I simply had not realized how long his acquaintance with our family had been building, in a manner of speaking." The maid, clearly relieved not to have caused genuine offense, returned her attention to the flowers, and Cassandra was left alone with her racing thoughts until Lady Winslow finally entered the parlor several minutes later, her sharp eyes immediately noting something different in her young guest's demeanor. "You look as though you have received rather startling news," Lady Winslow observed, settling into her chair with the easy confidence of a woman who missed very little. Cassandra hesitated only a moment before deciding honesty served her better than pretense. "Your maid mentioned that your nephew's interest in me existed before my engagement to Edmund ended," she said carefully. "I confess I had not understood the full history of his regard until just now." Lady Winslow's expression shifted into something between amusement and mild exasperation, clearly directed at her own household staff rather than at Cassandra herself. "That girl has always had a loose tongue about matters that are not hers to discuss," she said, though there was no real anger in her tone. "But I suppose the truth was bound to reach you eventually, and perhaps it is better you hear it plainly rather than through fragments of gossip." She proceeded to explain, with the same directness that characterized all her conversations, that her nephew had indeed noticed Cassandra well over a year earlier, during her first proper season, and had spoken to Lady Winslow herself about his growing admiration on more than one occasion. But upon learning of her engagement to Edmund, already formalized by that point through her father's negotiations, he had made the deliberate choice to step back entirely, refusing to entertain thoughts of a woman already promised to another man, regardless of his own private feelings on the matter. "He is a man of considerable principle, whatever else you may think of him," Lady Winslow continued. "He believed interfering with an existing engagement, however privately he might have wished circumstances were different, would have been dishonorable both to you and to himself. So he said nothing, did nothing, and simply waited to see whether happiness would find you elsewhere, content to admire quietly from whatever distance propriety demanded." Cassandra absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in her mind with growing understanding of exactly what kind of man had chosen, again and again, to offer her nothing but patient honesty rather than calculated pursuit. It transformed her understanding of everything that had happened since that terrible night outside the ballroom, revealing a depth of restraint and integrity she had not fully appreciated until this moment. "Why did he never tell me this himself?" she asked finally. "Because he did not wish you to feel obligated by the weight of his long patience," Lady Winslow said simply. "My nephew has never been a man who wishes credit for doing what he believes is simply right. He would rather you choose him because you wanted to, freely and without the burden of feeling indebted to some grand romantic sacrifice made on your behalf." The revelation settled something deep within Cassandra, some final lingering doubt she had not fully acknowledged even to herself, born perhaps from Edmund's cruel insinuation weeks earlier about the Duke's fickle attention. There was nothing fickle about a man who had waited over a year, silently and honorably, refusing to act on his own feelings simply because doing so would have required a dishonorable interference with another man's engagement. That evening, walking home through the gathering dusk with her mother, Cassandra found herself unusually quiet, absorbed in thoughts she was not yet ready to share even with her closest confidant. Her mother, sensing her daughter's distraction, did not press for explanation, though she watched with quiet curiosity as Cassandra's expression shifted between wonder and something like tender disbelief. Meanwhile, across the city, Word of the Duke's growing attentions toward Cassandra had reached ears far less friendly than Lady Winslow's household. Edmund, dining that same evening with Miss Granger's family, found himself distracted throughout the meal by whispered gossip he had overheard earlier that day at his club. Gossip suggesting the Duke's interest in his former betrothed ran considerably deeper and older than mere convenient timing following their broken engagement. He excused himself early from the evening's festivities, claiming a headache that Miss Granger accepted with polite concern but private disappointment, and walked the streets alone for nearly an hour afterward, turning uncomfortable thoughts over in his mind. He had told himself, in the weeks following his decision to end things with Cassandra, that he had made a purely practical choice, one any sensible man in his position would have made given the state of his family's finances. He had not allowed himself to consider what he might have discarded in the process, not until whispers began suggesting a duke had waited over a year for the chance to properly court the very woman Edmund had so casually released. The thought gnawed at him uncomfortably as he walked, mingling with an emotion he was reluctant to name even privately, something uncomfortably close to regret. He told himself it was merely wounded pride, the natural sting of watching another man succeed where he had failed to recognize value in his own possession. But as the days passed and the gossip about the Duke's evident devotion continued to spread through every fashionable drawing room in the city, Edmund found the discomfort growing rather than fading, until it settled into something he could no longer easily dismiss. Miss Granger, for her part, began to notice her betrothed's growing distraction whenever Cassandra's name arose in conversation, and though she said nothing directly, a certain coolness crept into her own manner toward him, the beginning of doubts about a match that had always been built more on practical fortune than genuine affection. Edmund, absorbed in his own uncomfortable thoughts, barely noticed the shift, too preoccupied with a growing, unwelcome certainty that he had made a far graver mistake than he initially understood on that fateful evening outside the ballroom. Back at her family's townhouse, Cassandra spent the following days in a state of quiet reflection, the knowledge of the Duke's long, patient regard settling into something warm and steady within her chest. When he called on her again that week, she found herself studying him with new eyes, understanding now the depth of restraint and honor that had shaped every careful, respectful gesture he had offered since that first night in the garden. "You knew," he said quietly, the moment he saw her expression, understanding immediately that some new knowledge had passed between them since their last meeting. "My aunt's household has never been particularly skilled at keeping confidences." "I know now," Cassandra confirmed softly, "and I confess it has changed my understanding of everything between us rather significantly." He seemed to brace himself slightly, as though uncertain whether this new knowledge would draw her closer or push her away. "I hope it does not trouble you," he said. "I never wished you to feel burdened by the length of my patience. I only wanted you to choose freely, without any sense of obligation attached to whatever I felt during a time when you belonged, by every proper measure, to another man's promise." Cassandra reached out then, an unusually bold gesture for the careful boundaries of their courtship thus far, and placed her hand gently over his. "It does not trouble me," she said, her voice steady with growing certainty. "It humbles me, rather considerably, to understand the depth of restraint you showed, and it makes me trust the sincerity of your regard more completely than words alone ever could have managed." Something shifted visibly in his expression at her words, relief and tenderness mingling openly across features usually guarded so carefully in public settings. "Then I am glad the truth reached you, however carelessly it arrived," he said softly, turning his hand beneath hers so their fingers could properly intertwine. "I find I have grown rather tired of half-truths and careful restraint where you are concerned, Cassandra. I would very much like the chance to be entirely honest with you from this point forward, about everything." "I would like that very much as well," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of certainty she possessed, understanding now more fully than ever before that whatever waited ahead for them would be built on a foundation considerably steadier and more honest than anything Edmund had ever offered her during their 5 years together. They sat together for a while longer in the quiet parlor, her mother present but tactfully absorbed in a letter across the room, allowing them the small privacy of lowered voices and unhurried conversation. The Duke spoke, for the first time, of his father, the cold, dutiful man Lady Winslow had mentioned weeks earlier, and of the lonely childhood that had taught him to guard his feelings so carefully from the world. "My father believed affection was a weakness unbecoming of a man in his position," he explained, his voice quieter than usual. "He taught me to value duty above all else, to measure every relationship by its usefulness rather than its warmth. I spent a great many years believing him, until I grew old enough to see the emptiness such a philosophy left behind in his own life, and in the lives of those around him." Cassandra listened with quiet attentiveness, understanding now why his restraint had run so deep, why he had chosen silence over pursuit, even when his own feelings urged him otherwise. "It explains a great deal," she said gently. "Your patience, your caution. It was never coldness, was it? It was simply a different kind of care, learned the hard way." "Perhaps that is a kinder way of describing it than I usually allow myself," he admitted, a faint smile touching his lips. "I have spent a long while trying to prove to myself that duty and feeling need not remain separate things, that a man might honor both his obligations and his heart without one destroying the other. I believe, watching you these past weeks, that I have finally begun to understand how that might be possible." Their conversation drifted afterward to lighter matters, memories of childhood, favorite books, small dreams neither had shared with anyone else in quite the same way. Cassandra found herself telling him about her own mother's early lessons in composure, the careful mask she had learned to wear at gatherings from a young age, and how strange it felt now to sit across from someone who seemed to want the truth beneath that mask, rather than the performance itself. When at last he rose to take his leave, he lingered a moment longer than strict propriety required, his gaze steady and warm. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her quietly. "I do not wish for any more careful distances between us. Whatever comes next, I would like to build it honestly, together, rather than through silent patience alone." After he departed, Cassandra's mother finally set aside her letter, studying her daughter's flushed, thoughtful expression with quiet satisfaction. "I have rarely seen a man look at anyone the way he looks at you," she said simply. "Whatever doubts Edmund tried to plant in your mind, I think you may safely consider them entirely uprooted now." Cassandra said nothing in reply, but the small, private smile she carried with her for the remainder of the evening spoke more plainly than any words could have managed. She thought again of the year of silent, honorable patience the Duke had carried without ever once breathing a word of it to her, of the quiet restraint that had cost him nothing less than watching, from a respectful distance, while she gave her heart to another man entirely unworthy of it. It was, she realized, the truest measure of character she had ever encountered, and it left her with no doubt remaining about the wisdom of trusting him with whatever came next. Later that night, alone in her room, Cassandra took out her journal once more and wrote a single line before setting down her pen. "Some men speak of love before they understand it. Others simply live it quietly, for as long as it takes to be seen." She closed the book gently, extinguished her candle, and slept more peacefully than she had in a very long time. The invitation to Lord and Lady Fairweather's summer ball arrived at nearly every fashionable household in the city, and Cassandra knew, the moment she saw the elegant card on the breakfast table, that Edmund would almost certainly be present. What she did not anticipate was the particular boldness he would carry into that evening, nor the depth of desperation that had apparently taken root in him over the preceding weeks. She arrived on the Duke's arm, a small but significant shift from her previous seasons, when she had always entered such gatherings beside her parents, or, in earlier years, beside Edmund himself. Heads turned as they crossed the threshold together, whispers rippling through the assembled guests, though the quality of those whispers had changed considerably since the early days following her broken engagement. Where once she had heard pity and quiet mockery, she now caught fragments of genuine admiration, curiosity mixed with something like respect for a woman who had weathered humiliation and emerged, somehow, more sought after than before. The evening began pleasantly enough. Cassandra danced twice with the Duke, an unusual indulgence for a man who typically avoided the dance floor entirely, and spent a comfortable hour speaking with old friends who had grown warmer toward her in recent weeks, sensing perhaps which way society's favor was now beginning to turn. It was nearly an hour into the festivities when Edmund finally approached, Miss Granger notably absent from his side, a detail Cassandra noted with some curiosity but did not immediately understand. "Cassandra," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of the small cluster of guests standing nearby. "You look radiant this evening. Rothbury is a fortunate man." She kept her expression carefully composed, recognizing immediately the performative quality of his greeting, delivered as though for an audience rather than for her alone. "Thank you, Edmund," she replied evenly. "I trust Miss Granger is well." Something flickered across his face at the mention of his betrothed, a discomfort he quickly masked with forced good humor. "She is visiting relations in the country this month," he said. "Marriage negotiations of this sort require a great deal of patience, as you well understand. Having waited 5 years for a proposal I ultimately could not follow through on as planned." The comment landed with obvious intent, a public reminder of their shared history delivered in a tone calculated to sound rueful rather than cruel, though Cassandra recognized the manipulation beneath it immediately. Beside her, she felt the Duke's posture shift slightly, a subtle tension entering his otherwise relaxed bearing. "I have found the intervening months rather more fortunate than I expected, given the circumstances," Cassandra replied, refusing to let Edmund's careful performance rattle her composure. Edmund's smile tightened at her steady response, and he glanced briefly toward the Duke before continuing, his tone shifting into something more pointed. "I wonder, Rothbury, whether you fully understand what you have taken on," he said. "Cassandra is a wonderful woman, truly, but I confess our parting was not without its complications. A man in your position deserves to know the full history before committing himself too far." The words hung in the air, deliberately vague enough to plant doubt without offering anything concrete enough to be directly refuted. Precisely the sort of careless cruelty Cassandra had come to expect from him during their final months together. Several nearby guests had stopped their own conversations entirely now, drawn by the tension crackling between the three of them, and Cassandra felt her cheeks warm with the familiar heat of public humiliation beginning to rise once more. But before she could formulate a response, the Duke spoke, his voice calm and level, carrying none of the anger she might have expected, and precisely because of that calm, cutting far more sharply than any raised voice could have managed. "I understand the full history rather well, Ashworth," he said. "I understand that you ended a 5-year engagement in front of a ballroom full of guests, with less warning and less kindness than most men extend to servants they are dismissing. I understand that you did so not because your feelings had changed, but because a larger dowry presented itself, and you calculated the trade worth making. And I understand that you have spent the weeks since watching, with evident discomfort, as the woman you discarded so carelessly has found happiness you apparently did not expect her to find, certainly not this quickly, and certainly not with someone of my particular position." The crowd around them had grown noticeably quieter, several guests exchanging startled glances at the Duke's uncharacteristically direct words, delivered without a single raised syllable yet somehow more devastating than any shouted accusation could have been. Edmund's face had gone pale. His earlier confident smile entirely vanished. "That is a rather unfair characterization," Edmund said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Is it?" the Duke replied evenly. "I was present that evening, Ashworth, in the garden where Lady Cassandra retreated after your performance on the front steps. I saw the state you left her in. I do not believe I am mischaracterizing anything." Edmund's gaze flickered around the gathered crowd, clearly registering for the first time the full extent of the audience witnessing his humiliation, a mirror image of the scene he had orchestrated months earlier, though this time he occupied the position of exposed cruelty rather than careless power. "I only meant to offer some caution," he said, his voice weaker now. The performance entirely collapsed. "A friendly warning, nothing more." "Cassandra needs no warnings from you," the Duke said, his tone softening only slightly, though the steel beneath it remained entirely evident. "She has demonstrated, repeatedly, and under considerably more difficult circumstances than tonight, a clarity of judgment and strength of character that I suspect you have never fully appreciated. I would suggest, if you wish to salvage whatever remains of your own reputation this evening, that you consider your next words rather more carefully than your last several." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Cassandra to hear her own heartbeat, aware of every eye in the vicinity fixed on the small tableau before them. She thought, for one uncertain moment, that Edmund might attempt some further defense, some clever retort to salvage his dignity in front of the assembled crowd. Instead, he simply straightened his coat, offered a stiff, shallow bow toward them both, and retreated into the crowd without another word, his earlier confidence entirely dismantled. For a long moment after his departure, no one spoke. Then, gradually, the surrounding conversations resumed, though Cassandra caught more than one admiring glance directed her way, and heard, faintly, a whispered comment from a nearby matron about how thoroughly Rothbury had put the young Viscount's son in his place. "Are you well?" the Duke asked quietly, turning his full attention back to her now that the confrontation had passed, his earlier steel replaced entirely by gentle concern. "I am," Cassandra said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was entirely true. She had expected to feel shaken by the public exchange, humiliated once more by Edmund's careless words. Instead, she felt something closer to vindication, watching the man who had once discarded her so casually, reduced to stammering retreat in front of the very society that had once pitied her. "Thank you," she added softly, meeting his eyes with quiet gratitude, "though I suspect I might have managed the exchange myself, given a moment longer." "I have no doubt of it," he replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "I simply did not wish to give him the satisfaction of watching you have to." They danced once more before the evening concluded, and Cassandra noticed, throughout the remainder of the ball, a marked shift in how other guests approached her. Warmer now, more genuine. Several older matrons making a particular point of complimenting her composure and wishing her well with obvious sincerity, rather than the careful, pitying tone she had grown accustomed to in recent months. The story of Edmund's public humiliation would, she understood, spread through the city's drawing rooms with the same speed as the story of her own humiliation had spread months earlier, though this time the narrative favored her entirely. As the carriage carried her home that evening, Cassandra found herself reflecting on how completely her circumstances had transformed since that terrible night outside the ballroom steps. She had entered this season expecting marriage to a man she had known and trusted for years, only to watch that expectation shatter in a single, cruel sentence delivered in front of strangers. She had spent weeks afterward navigating gossip and pity, uncertain whether she would ever recover her standing in society, let alone find happiness beyond what Edmund had promised and failed to deliver. Yet here she was now, seated beside a man whose patient honesty had proven itself repeatedly across the intervening months. A man who had defended her not with anger, but with calm, devastating truth. Precisely the kind of steady character she had once mistakenly believed Edmund possessed. The contrast between the two men had never been clearer than it was tonight, watching Edmund's careful performance collapse entirely beneath the weight of simple, honest facts the Duke had refused to soften for anyone's comfort but her own. "I hope tonight did not feel like a repetition of that first terrible evening," the Duke said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the carriage. "It felt entirely different," Cassandra assured him. "That night, I stood alone outside a ballroom while someone I trusted discarded me without a second thought. Tonight, I stood beside someone who refused to let that same person diminish me again. I do not think I could describe two experiences more different from each other, even though they both involved Edmund at the center of them." The Duke reached across the carriage and took her hand gently in his expression warm in the dim lamplight filtering through the carriage window. "Then perhaps we have finally managed to write a rather different ending to that particular chapter of your story," he said softly. Cassandra smiled, genuine and unguarded, feeling for the first time in months entirely free of the shadow Edmund's cruelty had cast over her since that first terrible night. "Perhaps we have," she agreed, and found herself looking forward, with growing certainty and hope, to whatever chapters still remained to be written. News of the confrontation reached Miss Granger within 2 days, delivered by a cousin who had witnessed the exchange firsthand and could not resist sharing every detail once she returned to her family's country estate. Miss Granger, who had already begun harboring quiet doubts about Edmund's distraction and evident preoccupation with his former betrothed, found the account confirmed something she had suspected for weeks, but had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She wrote to Edmund within the week, her letter brief and unsentimental, informing him that she believed it best to end their engagement before either of them committed further to a match built on considerably shakier ground than either had initially admitted. She cited, with polite but unmistakable clarity, her belief that his heart remained entangled with matters he had not fully resolved, and that she preferred to seek a match unclouded by such lingering attachments. Edmund received the letter alone in his study, and though he had spent recent weeks telling himself repeatedly that his engagement to Miss Granger represented the sensible, practical choice his family's finances demanded, the letter's arrival left him with an unexpected hollowness rather than the relief he might once have predicted. He had, in the span of a few short months, managed to lose both the woman he had known for years and the fortune he had sought to replace her with, undone entirely by his own careless cruelty and the pride that had prevented him from recognizing its cost, until it was far too late to reclaim what he had thrown away. Word of this second broken engagement spread through the city's drawing rooms almost as quickly as the confrontation at the Fairweather ball had, and Cassandra heard the news from her mother over breakfast a few days later, delivered with the particular satisfaction of a woman who felt her daughter had been thoroughly, if belatedly, vindicated by circumstances entirely beyond her own making. "I confess I take little pleasure in another person's misfortune," Cassandra said carefully, setting down her teacup, "though I cannot claim to be entirely surprised by the outcome." Her mother studied her for a moment, searching perhaps for any lingering trace of satisfaction or regret in her daughter's composed expression. "And how do you feel about it?" she asked directly. Cassandra considered the question honestly before answering. "I feel," she said slowly, "as though a door has finally closed that I did not realize I was still holding partly open. I do not wish Edmund harm, precisely. But I find I no longer feel any need to wonder what might have been, or whether I was somehow at fault for what happened between us. Watching him unravel his second engagement through the same carelessness that ended our first tells me everything I need to know about the choice I escaped, however painfully. Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently, an unusual display of open affection between them. That is a wiser conclusion than most young women manage to reach so cleanly, she said. I am proud of you, Cassandra. Truly. The following week, the Duke called on her again, and this time their conversation turned, for the first time, toward matters considerably more serious than the light, exploratory exchanges of previous visits. They walked together in her family's modest garden, her mother watching discreetly from the drawing-room window, while the Duke spoke with unusual hesitation about a subject he had clearly been considering carefully for some time. I have spoken with your father, he said finally, his tone carrying a gravity she had not heard from him before. Regarding my intentions toward you, and what might come of them, should you find yourself willing to consider a future together more formally than we have yet discussed. Cassandra's breath caught slightly, though she kept her steps steady along the garden path, her heart racing with an anticipation she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge until this moment. And what did my father say? She asked, her voice carefully measured despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. He gave his blessing without hesitation, the Duke replied, a faint, warm smile touching his usually composed features. Though he made it quite clear the final decision belongs entirely to you, regardless of any arrangement between himself and me. He is, I think, rather protective of ensuring you are never again placed in a position where your own wishes matter less than practical considerations. Something warm and full bloomed in Cassandra's chest at these words, gratitude toward her father mingling with growing certainty about her own feelings she had been quietly nurturing for weeks without fully naming them even to herself. I would like to hear the question properly, she said softly, glancing up at him with a small, encouraging smile, whenever you feel ready to ask it. The Duke's expression shifted into something between surprise and evident delight at her gentle prompting, and for a moment, the careful reserve he carried so consistently in public settings fell away entirely, replaced by an openness she had glimpsed only rarely since their acquaintance began. Not yet, he admitted, his voice low and warm. I find I want the proper moment for such a question, rather than a garden conversation, however pleasant. But I promise you, Cassandra, the question is coming, and I intend to ask it in a manner that reflects how seriously I regard the answer. She found she did not mind the wait at all, understanding now, more completely than ever, that whatever patience this man asked of her would always be matched by an equal patience and honesty in return. As they continued walking together through the quiet garden, the events of the Fairweather Ball and Edmund's subsequent unraveling, already fading into distant memory, Cassandra felt, for the first time since that terrible night so many months earlier, entirely and completely at peace with the direction her life was taking. 3 weeks passed before Cassandra received the invitation that would change everything, delivered not by messenger, but by the Duke himself, arriving unannounced at her family's townhouse on a bright autumn afternoon, with an expression she had not seen from him before, something between nervousness and quiet determination. Lord and Lady Ellsworth are hosting their annual autumn ball next week, he said, once he had been shown into the drawing room and exchanged the customary pleasantries with her mother. I understand it is the same estate, and very nearly the same ballroom, where you and I first crossed paths that evening in the garden. Cassandra felt her pulse quicken at the mention of that place, memories of humiliation and heartbreak still carrying a faint sting even now, months removed from the pain of that particular evening. I remember it well, she said carefully, though I confess I have not thought of returning there with any great enthusiasm. I understand your hesitation completely, the Duke replied, and I would never ask you to attend if the memory proves too difficult, but I find myself hoping you might consider it, for reasons I would rather explain there than here, if you are willing to trust me with the request. Something in his tone, careful and deliberate, suggested this invitation carried weight beyond a simple evening of dancing, and Cassandra studied his face for a long moment, searching for some clue to his true intentions. Her mother, seated nearby with her needlework entirely forgotten in her lap, watched the exchange with poorly concealed excitement, though she said nothing to influence her daughter's decision. I will attend, Cassandra said finally, deciding that whatever the Duke intended, she trusted him enough by now to follow wherever his careful planning led. Though I hope you understand what you are asking of me, returning to that particular ballroom. I understand completely, he said, his expression softening with evident relief and gratitude, and I promise you, whatever memories that place holds for you now, I intend for this visit to replace them with something considerably better. The week that followed passed in a blur of anticipation, Cassandra's mother fussing over her gown with more attention than usual, though she offered no explanation for her heightened enthusiasm beyond vague comments about the importance of looking one's best for significant occasions. Cassandra herself grew increasingly certain, as the days passed, exactly what the Duke intended to ask her within those familiar walls, though she said nothing of her suspicions to anyone, wanting to preserve the moment's surprise, even as her own heart raced with growing anticipation. On the evening of the ball, she dressed carefully in a gown of deep gold silk, a color she had chosen deliberately, remembering the pale, uncertain blue she had worn the night of her humiliation months earlier, and wanting, this time, to enter that same ballroom as someone entirely transformed from the woman who had fled it in tears. Her mother, helping arrange her hair, caught her eye in the mirror with a knowing, tender smile. "You look every bit the woman who deserves whatever waits for you tonight," her mother said softly, and Cassandra felt her eyes sting with unexpected emotion at the simple, heartfelt words. The carriage ride to the Ellsworth estate passed in comfortable silence, Cassandra's nerves building with each passing mile, until finally the familiar drive came into view, the grand house lit warmly against the darkening sky, precisely as it had been on that terrible night so many months before. This time, however, she did not arrive alone or distracted by another man's cruel departure. This time, the Duke waited for her at the entrance himself, having arrived earlier to make what she now suspected were careful arrangements of his own. "You look extraordinary," he said, taking her hand as she stepped down from the carriage, his eyes carrying an admiration he made no effort to disguise. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected given the anticipation building steadily within her chest. "Though I confess I am rather curious what you have planned for this evening." He offered only a small, mysterious smile in response, leading her toward the entrance without further explanation, though the warmth in his expression suggested whatever waited ahead had been prepared with considerable care and thought. The ballroom itself looked much as she remembered, glowing with candlelight, and filled with the same bright, sophisticated crowd that populated every significant gathering of the season. But this time, as they entered together, Cassandra felt none of the anxious uncertainty that had once accompanied her into such spaces, standing instead beside a man whose steady presence had become, over these past months, something she relied upon rather than something she questioned. They danced twice before the Duke requested a brief pause, guiding her instead toward the same garden path where they had first spoken all those months ago, the same oak tree standing sentinel over the same quiet bench, though now bathed in warm autumn moonlight rather than the cool light of early summer. Cassandra's heart began racing in earnest as she recognized the deliberate choice of location, understanding now with growing certainty exactly what this evening had been arranged to accomplish. "You remember this spot?" the Duke asked quietly, once they had reached the bench and turned to face each other beneath the sheltering branches. "I remember it precisely," Cassandra said softly. "It was here that a stranger offered me kindness on the worst night of my life, without asking anything in return." "It was here," the Duke agreed, "that I first understood how much I admired you, watching you carry such devastating humiliation with more grace and courage than most people manage facing far smaller difficulties." He paused, drawing a small velvet box from his coat pocket with hands that trembled slightly, an unusual display of vulnerability from a man normally so composed. "I have thought carefully, these past weeks, about where I might ask you the question I have been carrying in my heart for longer than you probably realize, and I could think of no place more fitting than the very spot where everything between us truly began, however painful the circumstances that brought us together that first evening." Cassandra's breath caught entirely as he lowered himself onto one knee before her, the velvet box opening to reveal a ring set with a single, elegant sapphire that caught the moonlight beautifully against its golden band. "Cassandra Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the evident emotion behind his words, "I have watched you these past months rebuild your life, with a strength and grace that has only deepened my admiration with each passing week. I have come to value your honesty, your courage, and your quiet resilience more than I ever imagined valuing anything in another person. I do not offer you convenience or calculation, the way you were once offered and then so carelessly denied. I offer you honesty, patience, and a devotion that has already waited over a year to properly declare itself. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and allowing me to spend the rest of my life proving that this choice, freely and completely made, will never be one you have cause to regret?" For a moment, Cassandra could not speak at all, overwhelmed by the weight of emotion building within her chest, memories of that terrible first night in this very garden mingling now with the profound joy of this transformed moment. She thought of Edmund's cold, careless words on the ballroom steps months earlier, of the humiliation and uncertainty that had followed, and understood now, with complete clarity, that every painful step of that journey had led her precisely to this moment, kneeling before her in the same garden where kindness had first been offered without condition. "Yes," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion but entirely certain. "Yes, I will marry you, gladly and completely, and I promise you in return every bit of the honesty and devotion you have shown me since that first terrible night." The Duke rose immediately, sliding the ring gently onto her finger before drawing her into an embrace that spoke more eloquently than any further words could have managed. The careful reserve he maintained so consistently in public settings entirely abandoned in this private, joyful moment. When they finally returned to the ballroom, hand in hand, the assembled guests seemed to sense immediately that something significant had occurred, and within minutes, word of the engagement spread through the gathered crowd, with the same swift efficiency that had once carried news of her humiliation through those very same rooms. This time, however, the whispers carried nothing but genuine warmth and admiration, guests approaching throughout the remainder of the evening to offer heartfelt congratulations, several older matrons commenting with evident satisfaction on how perfectly matched the couple appeared, how thoroughly Cassandra had triumphed over the cruel circumstances that had once threatened to define her entire season. Near the edge of the ballroom, Cassandra caught sight of Edmund standing alone, having apparently attended without a companion this evening, his expression carrying an unmistakable mixture of regret and resignation as he watched the celebration unfold around his former betrothed. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room, and for a moment Cassandra felt not anger or lingering hurt, but something closer to simple, quiet closure, an acknowledgement that whatever pain he had once caused her had ultimately led her toward a happiness far more genuine than anything he could have offered. She offered him a small, polite nod, neither warm nor cold, simply the acknowledgement one offers a distant acquaintance from another lifetime entirely, before turning her full attention back to the Duke, who stood beside her now not as a stranger offering unexpected kindness, but as the man she would spend the rest of her life beside, bound not by convenience or calculation but by patient, honest devotion that had proven itself steady through every test the intervening months had presented. As the evening drew toward its close, the Duke led her once more toward the center of the dance floor, and as they moved together through the familiar steps of a waltz, surrounded by candlelight and the warm approval of gathered friends and family, Cassandra thought back to that terrible night when she had fled this very ballroom, in humiliation and despair, certain her happiness had been irreparably shattered by a man too careless to recognize what he was discarding. She could not have imagined, standing in that dark garden all those months ago, accepting a stranger's quiet kindness with cautious uncertainty, that the very spot of her deepest humiliation would eventually become the setting for her greatest joy. But as the Duke pulled her slightly closer, his eyes warm with a devotion that had waited patiently for over a year to properly declare itself, Cassandra understood completely that some of life's most painful beginnings lead, with enough patience and courage, toward endings far more beautiful than anyone could have predicted on the night everything seemed lost. Later that evening, her father found them near the refreshment table, his usually reserved expression softened considerably by evident joy. He shook the Duke's hand firmly, then turned to embrace his daughter with a warmth she had not felt from him since childhood. "I could not have hoped for a finer match for you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to display in public. "Whatever pain the past months brought you, I believe you have found something considerably more lasting in its place." Lady Winslow arrived shortly after, her sharp eyes gleaming with unmistakable satisfaction as she surveyed the newly engaged couple. "Well," she said, addressing her nephew with characteristic bluntness, "it appears my garden party accomplished exactly what I intended it to accomplish, whatever protests you offered at the time about my interference." "I will not argue the point tonight, Aunt Winslow," the Duke replied, laughter evident in his voice for perhaps the first time all evening. "Tonight, I am simply grateful for it." Lady Winslow turned her attention to Cassandra then, taking both her hands warmly. "I told you, that first afternoon in my garden, that my nephew rarely speaks of matters close to his heart," she said. "I am glad to see he finally found the courage to speak plainly, and gladder still that you gave him reason to believe such honesty would be welcomed rather than doubted." Cassandra found herself unexpectedly moved by the older woman's evident affection, understanding now how significant a role Lady Winslow's quiet interference had played in bringing them to this moment. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for believing in us both before we quite believed in ourselves." As the evening wound toward its natural conclusion, the newly engaged couple found a quiet moment near the ballroom's tall windows, watching the last of the dancers move gracefully across the floor beneath the glittering chandeliers. Cassandra studied the ring on her finger, the sapphire catching the candlelight with quiet elegance, and thought of how differently this evening had unfolded compared to the last time she stood within these walls. "I have one more thing to tell you," the Duke said softly, drawing her attention back to him. "I spoke with your father not only about permission to marry you, but about the timing as well. If it suits you, I would like a short engagement. I have waited long enough already, Cassandra, and I find I have no wish to wait longer than propriety strictly requires." Cassandra smiled, warmth spreading through her chest at his evident eagerness, so different from the careful, patient reserve he had shown throughout their courtship. "I think," she said, "that a short engagement would suit me very well indeed. I have grown rather tired of waiting myself, if I am honest." They stood together a while longer at the window, watching the last dance draw to its close. Two people who had each, in their own way, learned patience the hard way, and who now stood ready to build something lasting from the ashes of one broken promise, and the quiet, steady foundation of another, kept faithfully across many months of careful honesty. Whatever challenges still lay ahead of them, Cassandra felt certain, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she faced the future not with uncertainty or fear, but with genuine, unshakable hope. On the carriage ride home that night, Cassandra sat quietly beside her mother, the ring catching stray beams of moonlight through the window as the city passed by in comfortable darkness. Her mother reached over at one point and took her hand, studying the ring with evident delight before speaking. "I remember the night you came home from that same house months ago," her mother said softly, her voice carrying none of its usual brisk practicality, only quiet tenderness. "You would not speak of what happened. You simply went upstairs and closed your door, and I stood in the hallway wondering how I could possibly help you carry such a burden. I did not know, that night, whether you would ever fully recover from it." Cassandra squeezed her mother's hand gently. "I did not know either," she admitted. "I remember thinking my life had narrowed down to whatever gossip would follow me through the rest of the season. I could not have imagined this outcome, not even in my most hopeful moments. Sometimes," her mother said, "the worst nights carry within them the seeds of the best ones, though we rarely recognize it until much later. I am simply grateful you had the strength to endure the waiting." Cassandra rested her head briefly against her mother's shoulder, an unusual display of open affection between them, though the evening's emotion had loosened something tender in her chest that she did not wish to guard so carefully tonight. "I could not have endured it without you," she said quietly. "Or without him, choosing patience when he might easily have chosen otherwise." Her mother said nothing further, simply holding her daughter's hand the remainder of the journey home, both of them content to sit in comfortable silence, turning over the events of the evening with private, grateful hearts. When the carriage finally drew to a stop before their townhouse, Cassandra lingered a moment before stepping down, looking back one final time at the glow of distant lights still visible from the Ellsworth estate, the same house that had once held her deepest humiliation, and now held, forever after, the memory of her greatest happiness. She climbed the stairs to her room slowly that night, turning the ring on her finger with quiet wonder, and before extinguishing her candle, she opened her journal one final time and wrote a short passage capturing the fullness of everything she felt. "Tonight, in the very garden where I once wept, I was asked to build a lifetime. I said yes without hesitation, because somewhere between that first terrible night and this one, I learned that the truest kindness rarely announces itself loudly. It simply waits, patiently and honestly, until the moment it is finally ready to be recognized for exactly what it always was." The wedding took place on a crisp morning in early winter, barely 3 months after the engagement had been announced, the short timeline exactly as swift as the Duke had once quietly wished for on the night of his proposal. The chapel overflowed with guests, far more than Cassandra had expected, faces she recognized from countless gatherings across the difficult months since her broken engagement, many of whom had once whispered pity behind their fans, and now arrived to witness what society had come to regard as one of the season's most remarkable transformations. Her father walked her down the aisle with unmistakable pride, his hand steady beneath hers despite the emotion evident in his eyes, and when he placed her hand in the Duke's at the altar, he offered a small, private nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything the past year had carried them through together. Cassandra's gown, a deep cream silk far removed from the pale blue she had worn the night of her humiliation, caught the morning light streaming through the chapel windows, and as she looked up into the Duke's steady, warm gaze, she felt none of the uncertainty that had once haunted her final months with Edmund. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of quiet vows and gentle smiles, the Duke's voice steady and sure as he spoke his promises, And Cassandra found her own voice equally certain when her turn came, unburdened by any lingering doubt about the choice she was making. When at last they were pronounced husband and wife, the chapel erupted into warm applause, and Cassandra caught sight of Lady Winslow dabbing at her eyes with obvious emotion, and her mother weeping openly with joy beside her father, who kept one steadying hand on his wife's shoulder throughout. The wedding breakfast that followed stretched long into the afternoon, filled with toasts and laughter, and the easy warmth of family and friends who had watched this particular love story unfold across many difficult months. Lady Winslow rose at one point to offer her own toast, her sharp wit softened considerably by genuine affection as she recounted, to the amusement of the gathered guests, her own role in orchestrating that fateful garden party months earlier. "I take full credit," she declared, raising her glass with evident satisfaction, "for recognizing what these two stubborn young people took considerably longer to admit to themselves." Laughter rippled through the room, and Cassandra caught the Duke's eye across the table, sharing a private, amused smile at his aunt's characteristic bluntness. Whatever careful reserve he had once carried into every social gathering seemed entirely absent today, replaced by an openness and warmth that Cassandra suspected few beyond their closest circle had ever witnessed from him before. Later that afternoon, as the celebration began winding toward its natural close, Cassandra found a quiet moment alone with her mother near the edge of the garden where the wedding breakfast had been held. Her mother studied her for a long moment, her expression carrying the particular tenderness reserved for significant milestones in a daughter's life. "I have watched you grow into a woman of remarkable strength this past year," her mother said softly. "I confess I worried, that first terrible night, whether you would ever fully recover your spirit. Instead, you have shown me something I hope your own daughters will one day learn from you in turn, that a broken promise need not break the person who trusted it, provided she has the courage to keep walking forward regardless of the pain." Cassandra embraced her mother warmly, grateful beyond words for the steady support that had carried her through the darkest weeks of the previous year. "Whatever strength I found," she said, "I found it partly because you never once let me believe the humiliation was mine to carry, rather than his." Her mother squeezed her hands one final time before releasing her back toward the celebration, and Cassandra returned to find her husband waiting for her near the garden's edge, his expression carrying the same quiet warmth that had first drawn her to him in that dark garden so many months earlier. "Are you happy?" he asked simply, drawing her close as the afternoon light began its slow descent toward evening. "Completely," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I do not think I have ever felt this certain of anything in my entire life." "Nor have I," he admitted quietly. "I spent a great many years believing duty and happiness existed as entirely separate pursuits, that a man in my position could expect one or the other but rarely both together. You have taught me otherwise, Cassandra, more thoroughly than I ever expected to learn." They settled into married life over the following weeks with an ease that surprised even Cassandra herself, the Duke's townhouse gradually absorbing small touches of her own presence, books she had loved rearranged onto shelves beside his, favorite flowers appearing regularly in vases throughout the rooms, small changes that transformed a house that had once felt somewhat cold and formal into something considerably warmer and more welcoming. Word occasionally reached them of Edmund's continued struggles, his family's finances still precarious, despite his earlier calculated attempt to remedy them through marriage. His reputation among the season's eligible young women considerably diminished following the public unraveling of 2 engagements within the same year. Cassandra found she felt genuinely little about these updates beyond a distant, faded curiosity, the emotional weight he had once carried in her life having dissolved almost entirely into the steady contentment of her new circumstances. One evening, several months into their marriage, as they sat together in the quiet comfort of their drawing room, Cassandra found herself returning to the memory of that first terrible night, curious now about details she had never fully asked her husband to explain. "Did you truly watch me for over a year before that night in the garden?" she asked, setting aside her book to study his face in the firelight. He considered the question thoughtfully before answering, as he considered most things. "I did," he admitted. "Though watch feels perhaps too passive a word for what I actually experienced. I noticed you, from nearly the first season you attended society gatherings properly. There was something in the way you carried yourself, thoughtful and genuine in rooms full of careful performance, that caught my attention almost immediately, and never quite released it afterward." "And you said nothing all that time," she said softly, still somewhat in wonder at the depth of restraint he had shown. "I said nothing, because you belonged, by every proper measure, to another man's promise, and I could not bring myself to interfere with that, however much I privately wished circumstances were different," he said. I told myself more than once that perhaps it was simply as well that a man like myself, raised on duty rather than warmth, might not know how to properly cherish someone as genuine as you seem to be. It was only watching you endure that terrible night with such courage that I finally understood how wrong that assumption had been. Cassandra reached across the small space between their chairs and took his hand, grateful beyond measure for the patient, honest man who had waited so quietly for circumstances to align in their favor, never once forcing the timeline of their story beyond what honesty and propriety allowed. "I am glad," she said simply, "that you finally stopped watching from a distance and chose, instead, to step forward." "As am I," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips with quiet tenderness, more grateful than I could ever properly express. Outside, the winter evening settled softly over the city, carriages rattling past on distant streets, the ordinary rhythm of London continuing much as it always had, indifferent to the particular joy found within this one quiet drawing room. But for Cassandra, seated beside the man who had waited patiently through her deepest humiliation to offer her, finally, the honest devotion she had once feared she might never find, the evening felt anything but ordinary. It felt instead like the quiet, steady beginning of everything she had once believed lost forever on that terrible night outside a glittering ballroom, transformed now into something considerably more lasting than she had ever dared to hope for during her darkest hours. Years later, when their own daughter grew old enough to ask about how her parents had first met, Cassandra would tell the story carefully, choosing her words with the same thoughtful honesty her husband had always shown her, explaining that sometimes the worst nights of a person's life carry within them, quietly and patiently waiting, the very beginning of their greatest happiness, provided only that courage and honest hearts are given enough time to find each other properly. Their daughter, a bright, curious girl named Eleanor who had inherited her father's steady thoughtfulness and her mother's quiet resilience, would listen to the story each time as though hearing it for the first time, always pausing at the same moment to ask the same question. "But were you not afraid, Mama, waiting in the garden that night, not knowing if anyone kind would ever come along?" "I was afraid," Cassandra would answer honestly, every single time. "But fear does not have to be the end of a story, my darling. Sometimes it is simply the beginning. And the only way through it is to keep walking forward, one small step at a time, and trust that kindness has a way of finding you exactly when you need it most, even if it does not look the way you first expected it to." The Duke, listening from his armchair nearby with the newspaper forgotten in his lap, would often add his own small addition to the story at this point, reminding his daughter that sometimes the person waiting to offer kindness has been watching quietly for a very long time, gathering the courage of his own to finally step forward, and that patience, properly used, could become one of the truest forms of love a person might offer another. Eleanor grew up hearing this story told and retold at family gatherings, at quiet evenings by the fire, at moments when she herself faced disappointments that seemed, in the small scale of childhood, as devastating as her mother's had once been on that terrible night outside the ballroom. Each time, the story offered the same quiet comfort, the same steady reminder that humiliation and heartbreak, however sharp in the moment, did not have the final word over a person's future happiness. Cassandra often thought, in quiet moments alone, of how strange it was that the very ballroom where she had once stood frozen in humiliation had become, through the slow, patient unfolding of months and then years, the setting she returned to most fondly in memory, the place where everything painful had eventually given way to everything good. She thought of Edmund only rarely now, and when she did it was without bitterness, simply a distant, faded chapter of a story that had ultimately led her somewhere far better than she could have imagined on that first terrible night. The Duke, for his part, never tired of reminding her, on quiet evenings when the house had settled into comfortable silence and the demands of the day had finally eased, that he considered himself the most fortunate man in London, not because fortune or title had ever mattered greatly to him, but because he had been given the rare privilege of loving someone who had taught him that duty and warmth need not remain separate pursuits after all, that a life built on patient honesty could hold considerably more joy than he had ever believed possible during the cold, dutiful years of his own upbringing. And so their story continued, not with dramatic declarations or further public confrontations, but with the quiet, steady accumulation of ordinary days, built on honest affection, precisely the kind of foundation neither of them had believed themselves fortunate enough to find, until circumstances, however painful in their beginning, had finally brought them together, in a garden neither of them would ever forget.